Notice, okay, we are live. Outstanding. Well, thank you so much to everybody for joining us today for this exciting discussion about Nord Stream 2. My name is, oh, sorry, I've got my volume on here. So the point of today is to make sure that our listeners get some idea of the complexities that we're dealing with at the moment as part of international rules-based order. The NATO Association of Canada, of which I'm the president, my name is Robert Baines. Our job is to make sure that people are paying attention to the many connections that we have globally. The non-zero-sum nature of the rules-based international order is something that all people should be aware of. It is not something that we've come to easily. It has taken a lot of negotiation, collaboration, constant work since the end of the Second World War, and it is not something that should be ignored or taken for granted. That's our whole point at the NATO Association of Canada, and I'm thrilled today to be able to have some amazing speakers who will be introduced in a moment. And the outstanding person who's going to be discussing and introducing our panelists today is Dr. Robert Cutler. He is our Senior Research Fellow at the NATO Association of Canada. He is also the director of our Energy Security Program. He had his education at MIT and the University of Michigan. He is a fellow of the Global Affairs Institute and has advised many companies and governments on energy security. And he has actually been the brain box who's behind this discussion today. So with that, Dr. Robert Cutler, please take it away.
Thank you, Robert Baines. This is the first webinar of a series of the Energy Security Program, and I am thrilled to have three highly qualified, more than whom there are none others highly qualified discussants for this panel. When I put together this panel, started about a month ago. Of course, Nord Stream 2 was in the news, but it wasn't in the headlines every day. So you may not need to be reminded very much about it, but let me just remind you briefly that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is projected to run under the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany, and this first agreed 5 years ago. It's only 94% complete. Construction now halted due to American sanctions. And now further obstacles from the European reaction to the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. So we are here to discuss the chances that it will ever be completed. And the three world-class experts, I was challenged on Twitter when I said they were world-class, but they really are superstars, are in order of presentation will be Dr. Sławomir Diebski, who earned a PhD in history from Jagiellonian University, the director of Polish Institute of International Affairs, leading foreign affairs and research institute in Poland. He joined it in the year 2000, was its director in 2007 after working his way up through the ranks. In 2010, he established the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding and was its director until he came back to the Polish Institute of International Affairs in 2016, and he's also the editor-in-chief of the Polish Diplomatic Review. And he will be discussing the geopolitical aspects. Second in order, we will have Dr. Maria Shagina, who earned her PhD in political science from the University of Lucerne. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Zurich and is also affiliated with the Graduate Institute in Geneva, where I spent a lovely year before it became the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies and was still part of the University of Geneva. And her focus is on sanctions. She has been studying sanctions for over 5 years, 6 years. She published widely. She's also been postdoctoral fellow in Japan, in the UK, and she is very highly qualified to speak about the sanctions. Then in the third place, but last but not least, none of them is least, is Dr. Alan Riley, who holds a PhD in European Union law from the Europa Institute, Edinburgh University, sits on the judicial panel of the Energy Community based in Vienna, has advised EU member states and governments, and was previously professor of law at the City University of London. So with that, First, Slavomir Debsky. I understand, I will speak about the geopolitics. I understand that, and I've asked them, their panelists all very well know that I asked them to limit between 12 and 14 minutes. Russian aims behind Nord Stream 2, the German calculus, impact on NATO-EU cohesion, geoeconomic consequences. We could go for an hour on this alone, but it's up to you to give us the highlights. Thank you, Slavomir. You're on.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert Baines, for setting this very important timely conversation. Let me start from kind of the personal remark. The first time I participated in behind the closed doors discussion on Nord Stream was 2005 in Berlin. And there was a meeting with very high-ranking experts, intellectuals from the United States, among them Fiona Hill, for instance, from Germany, Markus Eder was there, Alexander Rar was there, from Russia, a very knowledgeable group of people as well. And I was, head of the research office of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, invited to be part of this conversation. So from very beginning, I was able to see that the project is not only a business thing, that there is a lot of expectations from the Russian side to use the Nord Stream project as a purely political tool. And these expectations were, presented quite openly already then. So I heard that the project Nord Stream 1 already in that time would lock Germany into Russian gas supplies. It would enhance German-Russian relations. In private, I even heard that Russia would have access to key European decision-making cycles through the Nord Stream. So I realized two things immediately. Taking into account the Polish experience with Gazprom and Russia, in the way how Gazprom used its leverage on Poland through a Yamal pipeline, I realized that Germans would not only import through Nord Stream Russian gas, but they would also import willingly or unwillingly, I was not sure in that time, very particular business model, Russian business model. And immediately it provided a significant, important reasons for concern for Poland, for European Union. And here, yet additional remarks should be, I think, introduced. That was 1 year after Poland joining EU. So we were under very, heavy influence of this, euphoria mood that Central Europeans, Poles, after, long and tragic history, we would contribute to new political project in which solidarity, unity, common purpose would prevail and would govern, all this project. So with Nord Stream 1, this euphoria experienced a significant blow. It shows that kind of economic nationalism would still be there, and big countries, particularly big countries, are not willing to contribute to this European Union pan-national, post-national environment in the way we expected before joining the EU. So that was, psychologically, that was very significant blow, and this leads me to the list of aims my Russian interlocutors have been quite open to unveil to me over these years, both on various occasions, either in private meetings or political conferences of various kinds. So let me mention this list because it would make it clear to our audience how important Nord Stream 2 is, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 is for Russian authorities. First, it was quite clear that Nord Stream was meant to enhance Russian upper hand over transit countries, particularly Ukraine, but also to some extent Belarus. So it was meant to keep Ukraine and Belarus on Russians' political elite's mercy, this or other way. Then it was clear that the project was meant to lock Germany, but also Europe, to Russian gas supplies. If we take into account that there is a growing competition between various natural resources providers on the European market, the project which was expected to be big enough to fail, heavily protected by German political elite, because and I will come back to this. The role of Gerhard Schröder, in that time German Chancellor, in launching this project was very significant. Then Russians believe that Germany would become dependent on Russia, not only in energy aspects, in economic aspects, but also in politically. So for countries on NATO eastern flank, it would immediately become a source of concern. And after Russian aggression on Ukraine, we have to underline that the Nord Stream 2 project was launched after this aggression, after illegal annexation of Crimea. So all these, issues which show the reasons of concern for Central European already in 2005, 2006, and I would like to mention in that time Radek Sikorski, Poland's defense minister, who compared Nord Stream contract to Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And there was a fury both in Germany and Europe because of this comparison. So the warnings were there, but after a Russian aggression on Georgia, then Ukraine, all these concerns were, proved to be true and right, and the reasons of this concern were absolutely justified. And German stance on NATO-Russia funding act, when the German government, German political elite decided to keep, regardless of what Russia is doing, this legal political framework in place. However, Russia violated this agreement 18 times in very different aspects of this framework. Also provided a very significant reasons for concern for NATO eastern flank, that Russia would use Nordstream 2 and German dependency of Russian energy supplies as a political tool to drive a wedge into NATO, into a European Union, and to use it as a political tool. So that was a kind of the strategic framework from the Russian side. There is also a German aspect into that. We may consider why Germany was so much interested into signing such an agreement and contributing to that. And of course, they believe that it would give Germany an upper hand over other countries in energy issues in Europe, that they would create a kind of the hub, allowing German institutions, German companies to distribute gas and gas supplies over the Europe. Then, of course, it's clear, let's say, German, particularly car industry interest in the context of the climate change and technological revolutions. They wanted to secure access to direct access to energy supplies, and that was also clear from the Polish point of view. We have to bear in mind that Russian energy supplies to Germany were to some extent substituted by the Russia, exactly to arrive to this ultimate aim of Russia, to make Germany dependent on Russian supplies. The fact that the prices for gas, which were by the contract with Gazprom, Poland paid, and they were the highest prices in Europe, also can lead someone to the conclusion that Polish market substituted lower gas prices for German market for a very long time, and only in this year, because of EU regulations and the fact that Yamal was somehow embraced by EU legal framework, we are able to pay fair prices for Russian gas in Central Europe. So Polish calculus in this situation was quite clear. We have to break with dependency on Russian gas supplies as soon as possible. We invested heavily into LNG technology infrastructure. We built Baltic pipe, or we have been building Baltic pipe, which would allow us to import gas from another NATO ally, Norway, and in that way to react on Russia-German condominium in energy matters. So I think this strategic picture has been shaped already in 2005. All indicators proving the concerns of Central Europe and NATO Eastern Flank countries were justified. And now we are in a situation, as Bob already said, that Nord Stream 2 has been built up in 25% already, and it's very difficult now to stop it. But probably all other panelists would contribute to the discussion from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Slavomir, for a splendid introduction. And indeed, Maria Shagina will now discuss the sanctions from the US side, also perhaps from the EU side, that may put the final kibosh or may not on the pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Also, I believe she may discuss the German position before and after Navalny, as well as Russian attempts to bypass or mitigate the sanctions. So, Maria, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation from my side. And as was just mentioned, I'll cover the aspect of sanctions, and I have a short presentation to make it less boring and clearer. I hope you can see it. So as I was mentioned, I'll cover the US sanctions in a chronological order, how it was developing, and then what de-risking tactics the Russian side was having in mind and how successful they've been, but also what was EU position and the recent Germany's position in particular after the poisoning of Navalny. So it's important to have in mind the broader context of Western sanctions regime towards Russia. Prior to 2017, it was a well-coordinated sanctions regime between the US and the EU in terms of design, communication, and there was a person who was responsible for coordinating those actions. And upon the request from the EU side, gas sector was excluded from that regime. After 2017, we see the first divergence in the sanctions policy between the US and the EU. And here is the first legislation that tried to target Nord Stream 2, and I'm talking about CAATSA legislation, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that significantly widened the gap between EU policy and US policy. And why this gap was widened, first of all, because US tried to impose extraterritorial sanctions. So it's not just US persons, but also non-US persons, and you don't need any US nexus to impose sanctions. Second of all is that pre-existing sanctions been broadened and toughened, and I'll cover it in a second, but also is that the lifting of sanctions been contingent on approval by Congress, so it's no longer in the domain of executive orders by the US president. In particular, Section 232 targeted Russia's energy export pipelines. So as I said, the first attempt to target not just Russia's oil sector in terms of financial or technology related sanctions. And this section envisions that US, but also non-US companies and individuals who knowingly make significant investments, and this significant investments is up to interpretation by US sanctions unit OPEC, that those individuals or companies can be sanctions for these activities, whether it's construction, modernization or repair of Russia's pipeline that originated in Russia, not just transit. But it also included a ban on goods, services, information, and support that could be directly and significantly expand the maintenance or the construction of the pipeline with fair market value for one service more than $1 million or 5 as an aggregate fair market value. And this section, again, with certain pressure from back then Germany and Austria, was a very emotional letter that was sent from both ministries of foreign affairs. It included grandfathering clause that excluded Nord Stream 2, basically. Recently, it's been called in Politico as a Tillerson Amendment, Secretary of State lobbied apparently this clause to be included in this section. And the section also envisioned that the implementation of the sanctions will be only in coordination with allies, although it remains silent what type of mechanism will be, under what mechanism it will be implemented. And these sanctions are discretionary, so they are not must sanctions as the others. As the project developed, by that time in October 2011, the Danish Energy Agency granted permits to Nordstream 2. We've seen the first attempt from the US senators to stop it with other means, and the sanctions legislation is very cumbersome and it takes time. The strategy was to include it in the National Defense Authorization Act 2019. And the Protecting Energy, European Energy Security Act focused mainly on pipeline vessels and also on foreign persons who knowingly sold, leased, or provided the vessels for the construction of both projects, Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream, but also facilitated deceptive or restructured transactions to provide such vessels. The termination and sunset clause gives us an idea of what the objective was, and it was twofold. First of all, to minimize Russia's ability to use this project as a tool of coercion and political leverage, but also to push Russia to unbundle the energy production and transmission. And second is to ensure Ukrainian gas transit, that the transit will not be less than 25% from the 2018 levels. But as it always the case with sanctions, the deterrence is much more effective prior to the fact when the sanctions are imposed. So with a threatened letter to the Swiss-Dutch contractor Allseas, the company withdrew from the project, and since then we haven't seen much development. From the Russian side, we've seen, though, quite adamant statement that they were on course to finish it at all costs, by all means, and meaning that they would deploy their own vessels, Academic Chersky and the barge Fortuna. Academic Chersky was shipped from Russia's Far East. It took a very long route and not very clear route, was constantly changing its final destinations. Also, Gazprom filed an expansion with the request to expand the Danish Energy Agency permit to barge Fortuna that was without DPS, the dynamic positioning system, having in mind that both ships would be employed at the project to finalize it. Also, we've seen various de-risking tactics to restructure ownership of both pipeline vessels and supply vessels. So, for example, the Academic Chersky's owner is no longer Gazprom Fleet, but is an obscure company in Samara, so-called Samara Thermal Energy Property Fund, and same mechanism was employed to supply vessels that have been in Mukran port for a while. Crucial information also disappeared from Gazprom's website when it comes to retrofitting. What Academic Chersky was actually retrofitted, modernized with requirements to lay pipelines of that particular diameter and not smaller. Apparently, Gazprom had problems to find an insurer, and so this information was erased, and this is case with other sanctions. So all of this was basically based on an idea on banking that Gazprom is too big to sanction, so it was just creating multiple layers between Gazprom and these obscure companies, thinking that the US will not dare to sanction Gazprom. So again, as an interaction game from the US side, we see a second attempt to kill the pipeline, and it's the recent developments, the so-called Protection Europe's Energy Security Clarification Act was added with a similar tactic to the National Defense Authorization Act for year 2020. and this again tightened the sanctions against Gazprom. And we've seen the shift from the emphasis on pipeline vessels to pipeline activities. So the scope of sanctions has been expanded, and it includes also site preparation, survey and trenching, also important underwriting, insurance and reinsurance. Technology upgrades, but the most important sanctions provision is, of course, services for the testing, inspection, and certification, as a Norwegian company is currently in charge of certification. So currently, the act has been passed by both Congress and in the House of Representatives and senators, and it's currently being reconciled internally. So what will be important is which version will be passed. Ultimately, the House of Representatives version is much weaker, as it does not include the provision on sanctioning for certification or inspection. Also, the vague formulation that was probably made with the idea to cast the net wider to deter other actors to engage with the pipeline, worried German authorities, as an internal report circulated among German authorities, raised the concern that German Bundesnetzagentur, an independent energy tariff regulator, would be sanctioned under this. And again, in a similar fashion, a threatening letter to the owner of Mukran port was sent by the US senators. So far, it hasn't seen the same effect as with Switch Dutch OCs, but it remains to be seen what will be later. And the latest development when it comes to sanctions legislation is associated with the updated CATSA guidance that was updated in July, 15th of July this year, and it basically removes this grandfathering carve-out that I mentioned in the first slides. So investments made after July this year, 15th of July, will be sanctionable. There is a period to wind down operations, but basically it is passed with the intention to deter any further investments to the project. The US and Germany's response has been unanimous when it comes to extraterritorial sanctions. The increasing pressure from the US to stop the project basically united US, Brussels and Berlin in their opposition to US extraterritorial sanctions. They were called as a contradiction to international law. EU also mentioned that it would update the blocking statute, although there is a limited effectiveness to how much it would help European companies. But also as a side effect, this pressure consolidated Germany's position on Nordstream 2 across the party lines, whereas before we've seen clear distinction between Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, and now that was not the case any longer. But also German public has been largely supportive of the project because of this external pressure, and of about 55% of the German public were still in favor of the project. So as a compromise, Germany's position was to support Ukrainian gas transit. Has currently been achieved for the next 5 years. But we've seen quite dramatic shift in position between EU and Germany after the poisoning of Navalny. First of all, there's been a watershed moment within Germany. Has been an open questioning as to whether Germany's Ostpolitik, that's been a policy designed under Willy Brandt in the 70s and 80s, is still up to reality, whether change through rapprochement, change through trade is still valid in the current context of Russia's wrongdoings over the past at least 6 years. And there are options whether how to react to this and whether also to link it. And there's been a watershed moment in terms of for the first time, Germany did not exclude to link the two issues, Navalny and Nord Stream 2. So the latest development, and we can discuss this further in greater detail, is that the positions between EU and Germany diverged. While Germany has been trying to push for EU-level solution, EU is clearly saying that this is a German project. We don't want to link them together, and it is increasingly looking that they will impose human rights sanctions, which will be lengthy to implement, but hopefully possible. And Germany is left with multiple options how to stop the pipeline, whether it's an environmental legal challenge, or it's a moratorium or a cancellation that could lead to other legal ramifications. And I'll stop here, thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for such a comprehensive coverage of the relevant topic of the sanctions, which will become only more salient as time goes on. We pass now to Alan Riley, who will be speaking about the legal order, EU law, how this affects, amongst other things, the questions of sanctions, but not only, the role of Poland, perhaps the so-called third energy package, if it's pertinent, EU law and certification, I give the parole to I give the floor to you now, Alan.
Thank you very much. And it's very nice to be on this panel. It's very informative on a lot of the issues. I'm going to turn to the law now, but I hopefully I won't get into too much technicality and provide you a reasonably broad overview. I think one of the places which I think is worth starting is this, that if you go back to June of 2015, when Vladimir Putin launched Nord Stream 2 in St. Petersburg, I think if he had realized the level of grief that he was about to embark upon, I am pretty sure he would never have tried to do this. And I think what it goes back to is this, is that originally, the model for Nord Stream 2 is Nord Stream 1. So because they got Nord Stream 1 through, they assumed, well, we can just do the same thing again and get Nord Stream 2 through. And they didn't think about any of the changes that had occurred since Nord Stream 1. And to my mind, there are three key changes. One, of course, is the geopolitics. This is, by 2015, you've got the invasion and occupation of parts and annexation of parts of Ukraine. We've had Georgia, so forth, which makes a very big difference. But it wasn't just that. There was also a major legal change. And I think there was a complete lack of awareness of that. Whilst Nord Stream 1 was being developed, the EU was in the process of adopting the third energy package, which is a whole series of liberalization measures in the electricity and gas sector. And the point about the third energy package, unlike the second energy package and so on, they are much more substantial. They bite much more deeply. And they were designed actually not to deal with Gazprom, but to deal with the Western energy majors. So they are tough provisions actually directed at our own energy companies and not at Gazprom. But of course, they have the effect of also applying to Gazprom. And I do not think they understood that. The other element, which I think is also important in relation, and Slawomir alluded to this, is that when Nord Stream 1 was in the process of coming into being, the Central and Eastern European states were just joining the Union. So they did not appreciate how to pull all of the levers and make everything work effectively in their favor. Now we've got much more law, not just the legislation, but case law, guidance, decisional practice. And we have got states who know how to make the rules work. And that put the whole thing in a different place. And if you ask me what is the core of the problem for Gazprom in relation to Nord Stream 2, it is really four things. One is the third-party access, that essentially you've got to allow market access to other companies, not just Gazprom, to the pipeline. There's this issue, of course, you know, the actual pipeline starts in Russia, but nevertheless, third-party access. The second is tariff regulation, transparent tariffs. Now, the problem with this is you have transparent tariffs and you're offering different deals. That could trigger a whole series of problems, antitrust problems with the competition authorities, but also you could trigger real problems with price reviews by other customers of Gazprom who've got long-term supply contracts on other pipelines who are paying more money than they've got a different and worse deal with Gazprom. And the third is ownership and bundling, which essentially requires for all new infrastructure adopted after 2009 a separation of the pipeline from the people supplying the gas, which of course makes it difficult for Gazprom to own the pipeline. And then on top of that is Article 11, which is the Article 11 of the Gas Directive, which is the provision which says that it requires an assessment from a non-EU owned owner of a pipeline as to whether or not they pose a threat to the supply security of the assessing member state or the union as a whole. And obviously, given the backstory and the history, that is a problem. And there was no, my impression is that they did not really think that this was a real issue. So the first step was to simply say EU law doesn't apply. Now, the difficulty with that was that Nord Stream 1 there was a whole process, there was both Nord Stream 1 and there was also South Stream. And there was actually a process by which EU law was in the process of being applied. There was infringement procedures in relation to South Stream. And in relation to Yamal, this is the other pipeline which runs through Belarus and then into Poland, that actually was that was an import pipeline which was subject to the application of union law. So rather tricky. Nevertheless, all these arguments which were running back and forth, and ultimately what happens is the Commission formally adopts a proposal for a formal extension of the pipeline to import pipelines. That's ultimately agreed by the Council in February of 2019. And the cutoff date is the 23rd of May 2019. So if your pipeline is completed by that date, you fall outside the application of the legislation. If it's not complete, you will then be fully subject to it. And on the 23rd of May 2019, basically around 40% of the pipeline is complete, and Gazprom does not have all the route permits. It has no route permit for Denmark, and in fact, it does not get a route permit for Denmark for another 5 months. Now, of course, Gazprom is now running a damages claim before the Energy Charter Treaty, under the Energy Charter Treaty system, in an arbitration panel. Now, this is all very well, but it's extremely difficult to run that argument for the simple reason that if you try and run that argument, you come up against the argument as, why did you take the final investment decision and even start construction when you didn't have all the route permits? You're not acting as a responsible investor. And it also raises another problem for Nord Stream 2, is that the Commission's, the legal service, the legal service of the EU Council will be asking for a discovery of Nord Stream 2 and Gazprom documents in relation to the issue of why did you start construction when you didn't have all the permits? Was the issue that you wanted to get it all finished before December 2019 and it was all in a rush and you weren't being a responsible investor because you wanted to cut off Ukraine? Now the problem is that that's not a legitimate commercial decision. And it makes it very difficult to say those in those circumstances, you have any claim at all. But the fundamental problem is I'm not a responsible investor if you start constructing a pipeline when you haven't got all the permits in place. So that's a very, very difficult one. There'll be lots of talking about it, lots of PR around the prospect of billions of dollars of damages. But I think they're on fundamentally a sticky wicket with this, extremely difficult to sustain that argument. And that takes me to the sanctions arguments. How can they run sanctions arguments if the EU itself decides to impose sanctions? And again, it's very difficult because essentially you've got two things. First of all, a legitimate objective to sanction Russia in relation to the poisoning of the leader of the Russian opposition and the interference in Belarus. And you have a legitimate target because Nord Stream 2 is 100% owned by Gazprom, which is a state-owned company, which is controlled and directed by the Russian state. So you have a legitimate target, which is reinforced by the fact that it has, Nord Stream 2 itself, has geopolitical objectives, which we've already discussed. So in many ways, you can see that the scope for the Russians to challenge, to bring a sanctions damages claim, to first of all strike out the sanctions at EU level and obtain damages is very limited. And equally that will be true for the ECT, because the point about the arbitration was essentially what they look at is, do you have an objectively justified reason for doing what you're doing? And clearly we do have. So that puts it in a much more difficult place for Moscow than you would first think. Now I can go on about lots of other things, but I think what I'm going to do is, because I realize there's going to be hardly any time for questions. So I shall stop here and perhaps then we can take some questions.
Well, thank you, Alan, for a magisterial survey, which was at the same time clear and cogent of the issues, of the legal issues surrounding. Now, typically, the chair of the panel has the opportunity to avail himself, I use that pronoun, that's my pronoun, of the privilege of the first question, but I want to ask Robert Baines, since since we are, as I understand it, very well attended, and this is a very current issue, have already a number of questions come in to be posed from the audience?
We do indeed.
In that case, I will not exert the privilege that chairs often have, and I will hand the question section directly over to you, and you will, and you know this, I'm informing everyone else, and you will be the moderator of the question and answer session.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Robert. Well, magisterial is right, and I just wanted to, our first question was actually from one of our team at the NATO Association, very interested in a forecast. I know most of you are probably a little hesitant to do that, but as Robert mentioned, it's about 94% complete. And I'd just like some odds. What are the odds that it'll be completed anytime soon or at all? I'd love to hear from all three of you. Slawomir, seeing as you went first and laid the scene.
Okay. Well, analysts are, not the best one to predict how the future may look like. But let me say a few words about Nord Stream legacy, because it would give us a perspective how the project may be developed in the future. So first, we have to remember that German political class have invested into this project heavily for last 15 years. And I would like to mention here not only Gerhard Schröder, but also Angela Merkel. The fact that Gerhard Schröder and his involvement into Nord Stream 1 has not been investigated properly by the German authorities. Makes Angela Merkel responsible for the whole project, because there was a kind of the political agreement between the SPD and Christian Democrats already then Gerhard Schroeder is somehow untouchable individual, that he would represent a German state in this business, and he would take care of German interest in this business. So because of that, there is a question of legacy of Angela Merkel. We all know that she's about to leave our political scene in Germany soon. And there is a kind of the competition, how to define Merkel's legacy now. And there are proponents of this legacy, and there are those who are against this legacy. And that's the purely political issue in Germany already now. So this dispute would determine, depending on who would actually win this discussion. The conclusion would influence the ultimate future of the project. There is yet another issue. I think the US sanctions may be put in place even if the Nord Stream 2 is completed. So the sanctions would be, would target not, building the pipe and the whole project, but the operation of Nord Stream 2. And then, of course, it could again influence German calculus, German political elite calculus, because I believe there is a bipartisan, let's say, stance in DC against Nord Stream. So, regardless who would be in charge of US policy after November, we may have very significant anti-Nord Stream push from the United States.
Great. Maria, how about yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question that everybody wants to have an answer to right now. I think three factors are crucial in this. First of all is the internal German debate, whether it will evolve into the continuing Ostpolitik as it was, the sort of business as usual policy with Russia, or whether it will evolve into a revision, how we should deal with Russia. And that largely depends on the Social Democrats, given that right now we have a coalition government. The latest poll results shows that both parties are very divided in their stances, whether to keep Nord Stream 2 or whether to cancel it. And so far, the most prominent voices that criticize the project came from Merkel's party, Christian CDU party. So in this case, it's important to tip the balance, but for that, to tip the balance, we need criticism coming from SPD, and so far it's been only Foreign Minister Heiko Maas who clearly linked it to Navalny, but also included in the options as a reaction to Navalny's poisoning. So whether Germany will see this as a clear red line or not, and with Navalny's speedy recovery, the urgency of the issue might diminish. And as sad as it sounds, this might not be as urgent as it seemed like a week ago. Second factor, which is important here, is whether Germany will manage to push EU-level response to Nord Stream 2. So far, we've seen, as I mentioned during my presentation, twice has been a rejection of this option coming from European Commission, that it should be dealt bilaterally between Russia and Germany. And here would be, if Germany succeeds to actually implement the EU gas directive and by legal means to stop Nord Stream 2, that would be something good for the EU legislation and the common energy market in general. And third factor, if these two issues these two factors fail, we still have EU sanctions that are looming in the background. And with Biden presidency, there is then again a more pressure, more urgency to implement them. Sorry. And here it will be important which version will be adopted in the National Defense Authorization Act. If it includes certification, we can say this project will be killed. If you can find some obscure company that will agree to insure the pipeline, or some other obscure company that, I don't know, will give you a vessel or something like this, the certification needs to be done by an independent company that will be accepted by the Danish Energy Agency. So this is the final stop, I guess, will be with certification.
Right. And finally, Alan, from your point of view, the legal side of things, well, what seem to be the odds, or how likely is this to be stopped?
Well, before I get to the legal side, my own feeling about it is this: that the core element of this is to look at the likely Russian actions, particularly in relation to Belarus. If we essentially have more support of suppression of the legitimate democratic rights of the Belarusian people, and it's going to become quite difficult, I think, for the European Union and indeed Germany itself to do anything other than support the cancellation of the pipeline in whatever form we decide to cancel it. So I think one of the issues to look at is, what is the direction of travel? It seems to me the direction of travel is in the direction of the situation becoming more problematic in relation to Russia, not less. If that is the case, then presumably we are going to end up in a situation where some form of sanctions will be imposed. Now, the question is what sort? I mean, my own sense of this is that if Germany moves in the direction of sanctions, then practically the most effective way to do this is at the EU level. There are several reasons for this. One of the fact, of course, it's not just a German project. It's all the financing of the project. On the Western side is Dutch, it's Austrian, it's British, as well as German and French. So there is that. There's also the fact that the pipeline covers the territorial waters of 2 member states and the exclusive economic zone of 6 member states. So that reinforces the sense that it is something which you want to do at European level. And the other reason for it is that the EU has a sanctions machine which it can deploy. And I'm pretty sure that the Commission's legal service is probably already working through what they would look like. And the other question is also is that if the American sanctions for all of the attacks upon them are actually incredibly targeted on pipe laying activities and services. So it's a very targeted measure. And one can see that a very simple solution will be to, despite all the rhetoric, would create a parallel European sanctions pretty much on the same side as the Russians. And I say, for the reason I've always suggested, then any legal challenge will run down the EU route. That would be, i.e., an application by Nordstream 2 before the EU General Court, and then on appeal to the Court of Justice of the Union. That, I mean, the experience of that is, as long as you've got it set up in a proper sort of way with a legitimate objective and a legitimate target, I think it would be very difficult to see how those sanctions would be a challenge. Not even a matter of damages; they wouldn't be able to be overturned. And then equally, I think it will be difficult for similar reasons with a second energy charter legal claim. That's not to say that they would not try it, but I think it's pretty secure if you run it in that direction. So that's why, I would think, first of all, do I think it's likely to happen? I think the direction of travel is yes. It is more likely than not that those sanctions will be imposed. And if they were imposed, I think we can do it in a fairly legally robust way.
All right. Well, thank you. And I did also just want to check all of you are okay for time. We're now at the 1 hour mark, but I think we're planning to go about another 15 or 20 minutes. Does that work with everybody, or?
That's fine. That's fine.
Great, thanks so much. Slawomir, I think this question is probably mainly for you, but the rest of the panel might be interested in weighing in. It's Poland did not want the Baumgarten hub. It does not want the German hub. What is the alternative? To me, Nord Stream 2 is just cutting out Ukrainian risk.
Well, Nord Stream, first, Nord Stream 2 was meant to bypass Central Europe generally, and to make Germany a kind of the transit country for Russian gas for Central Europe. So, of course, Poland's government and other governments in this part of the world have already reacted to this perspective. And I fully agree with Alan that now the circumstances and the capabilities of the countries of the region are completely different than it used to be 10 years ago. So a kind of the countermeasures have been implied. Now Poland would be absolutely able to get rid of Russian gas at all, completely. So with LNG infrastructure in place, with Baltic pipe in place, now we will be able to shape the gas market in more market way in Central Europe. Additionally, some political/economic measures were introduced. So-called Three Seas initiative was launched, which is meant to build a common market for gas coming from other sources than Russia. So also from Qatar, Middle East, United States, obviously Norway. So also in terms of economic countermeasures, a lot has been done. And now I would say the main concern is how Nord Stream 2 would work if it's in place, if it's operational, as a Russian political tool, the instruments of making Germany dependent politically on Russia. That would be the main issue now.
Do Alan, Maria have any comments on that at all?
Well, one of the things I would say is that it's not the phrase was used, Ukrainian risk. And I think the way to look at it is not a Ukrainian risk, it's a Russian risk. I mean, you've got this, the great by Robert Larson on the scale of Russian energy cutoffs between 1991 and 2004. It identifies about 40 different politically motivated Russian energy cutoffs, both gas and oil. You have the 2009 and 2006 Ukrainian crises. We've got the 2014-2015 crisis, when essentially, in order to stop Ukraine receiving gas on reverse flow, which is perfectly part of the usual commercial transactions within the European liberalized energy market, the attempt by Gazprom to reduce the amounts of gas to Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia in order to stop gas being resold to the Ukrainians. So the risk is with Nord Stream 2, the risk is not with Ukrainian Brotherhood pipeline. The risk is with Russian pipelines, and particularly Russian pipelines, where that then creates a more significant degree of dependence on Central Eastern European states on direct Russian-controlled pipelines than ones which run through Ukraine. So the risk is not Ukrainian, the risk is Russian, and we should always remember that.
Just to add a couple of points, since we're talking about Ukraine a lot, and it largely remains as a object rather as a subject, as an actor in this triangle between EU, Russia. It's important also to analyze what steps Ukraine has done to diminish this gas dependence over the last 6 years, and it's been a dramatic change. Could be described as one step forward, two steps back, but for Ukraine, it's been a dramatic progress in what it has achieved in terms of reducing dependence on Russian gas since 2016. Of course, it's all rerouted, or at least the molecules of Russian gas are rerouted via the EU, via Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. So it's important to continue to connect Eastern European countries between themselves to sort of get rid past this legacy of very centralized infrastructure system that was designed in the Soviet times. So this is, we see the consequence of this legacy that still carries on how it's been designed, just from the infrastructure perspective. But also Ukraine adopted EU acquis, or at least aspires to adopt them in certain areas. So it's important, of course, for Ukraine to diminish its energy intensity. It's one of the most energy intensive countries in Eastern Europe, more than Poland, more than others as well. And again, it's due to this legacy from the Soviet time that a lot of heavy machinery, heavy industry has been placed in Ukraine. So Ukraine has been sort of not a hostage, but it is where it is right now, that it needs a lot of gas. And a couple of weeks ago, I believe, since Germany is also very much involved in the process, German government signed a cooperation with Ukrainian authorities to work towards diminishing energy efficiency. So the heating in the buildings needs to be properly regulated, insulated, and so on. Speaking from my own experience, how it's done during winter times. And so on. So in all of this discussion, we need a broader context, and Ukraine needs to be an active actor in this, not just a passive bystander, since it's doing quite a lot in this regard as well.
That works actually perfectly, leading into a few other questions we have related to dependency or a lowering of dependency on LNG. We've got a few questions just about how the environmental spirit that we've had, certainly since June of 2015, it's changed significantly. The expectations of dependence on more sustainable sources of energy. I'd just like to get everybody's opinion on how that may have changed the discussion in the past 5 years, especially about Nord Stream 2 and its impact on how much dependency has receded, perhaps.
Okay, sure. Perhaps I should take that. I mean, one of the difficulties with the whole idea of building another pipeline route for Russian gas. And remember, it's not even a new source of gas. All it is a diversion of gas from the Ukrainian network to the Russian network. So we're not even talking about that. So we're actually spending capital on building an alternative route, a diversionary route. So there's the actual overall, if you're going to spend cash on energy infrastructure, you think you wouldn't want to spend 10 billion on this. You might want to spend it on perhaps wind farms or solar. And the reinforced argument for that is this, that since in the last 10 years, the cost of solar has dropped by 80%. And the cost of wind has dropped over 40%. Now, when you have that sort of level of reduction, where you've got a situation where solar and wind are cost competitive with fossil fuels, why on earth would you just spend 10 billion on a pipeline, on a mere diversionary pipeline? So I think there's a simple issue of cost allocation, of building extra capacity, which is not needed, when you could have spent it on building wind farms. I think that is an environmental point, because one of the questions which I think legitimately I think a lot of the environmental NGOs raise is the privileged capital position of fossil fuels. That even when it seems to be more cost competitive to build wind power or solar farms, we end up spending the money on more not unnecessary capacity in the fossil fuel sector. So I think there is a real argument about that, which we should really play with.
The nods all around.
Can I add more points to that? I think it's important to bring another independent actors. I mean, independent is a misnomer for them. Novatek and Rosneft, that's been rivaling the dominance of Gazprom on the pipeline gas market. And with arrival of LNG, and Novatek has been the leading company in this, we've seen more tensions between these two companies in particular. Rosneft so far is lagging behind. And now in the last year, Novatek shipped almost 90%, maybe not 90, but I'll withdraw from giving the exact figure, but it's been a lot to irritate Gazprom and to voice its criticism openly, saying at least to CEO, that Novatek pledged to ship 90% of its LNG to Asia, and that was voiced as a key market. But this is the reality, that LNG market is so liquid that sometimes it ends up in the US as well. So you cannot control it. So there is an internal division between the tensions between the two, whether Novatek will rival pipeline gas from Gazprom in the future, and whether it will ship more to Asia in particular. And also with COVID-19, of course, the discussion's been shifted to renewables, to carbon neutrality. And here with EU Green Deal, we've seen more push in the EU in particular to diminish CO2 emissions, whereas in Asia, gas is more favorably seen. So Russian companies will have more opportunities on the Asian market, and the recent developments sort of give a confirmation to that, with Gazprom launching again without clear indication from China that it clearly wants this Power of Siberia 2, it wants to expand the pipelines to China. For the short term, we will Gazprom will be dependent on export to Europe, but whether it will be the case in the long term is the main question.
Vladimir, any points?
Very quickly, two additional remarks. First, we have to bear in mind that we don't need much more gas in Europe now. Europe is full of gas because of COVID, because of economic transformation, because of new Green Deal policies in place. There is absolutely enough. There is no demand in Europe for more Russian gas. We have to also bear in mind that even in the peak of demand, of European demand, 1/3 of Ukrainian gas pipes were not used by the Russians. So even then, there was a, let's say, overcapacity in terms of gas routes transportation. So it would also influence the calculus in terms of sanctions on Nord Stream 2, because if there is no demand, there is more room for political maneuver and targeting for political reasons of this part. And I stop here.
Great. Okay, I've just got one more question, and then I'll hand it over to Robert. And it's a question about the connection between the price war earlier initiated by Russia this summer and whether it was connected. Was it a direct response to the U.S. sanctions or the threat of U.S. sanctions on Nord Stream 2? Anybody?
I don't know. I'm happy to take it. I think the issue of the price war is that you've got to ask. I mean, clearly, Gazprom has, at least for the moment, there's an issue for the future, because as you get depletion in the gas fields, they have to bring on new fields, and they're not as cheap. But for the moment, they've got a lot of Soviet legacy gas fields where the gas is just being pumped out, the costs are all sunk, and the prices are low. And therefore, they can engage in a price war. The problem, however, is the ability to sustain it over time. Because the difficulty is that depending on the year, depending on the price levels, Gazprom provides between 5 to 10% of the Russian federal budget. So there is a real issue about the costs of profit sacrifice in fighting a gas war. They can do it, but the downsides are very direct. And that's particularly in a situation where the oil revenues are down and the costs for COVID and other things increase, the demands on the budget are greater. And the overall economic situation is darker. So there's a real question, I think, as to how long they can sustain any sort of price war in this context. It's not as if it's like 2008, when they could sustain a price war for a significant length of time, and knowing that they would be able to then rapidly recoup from the markets. That's not the situation now. The other point about it is that recoupment itself becomes difficult because of the scale of competition, which is different from the situation it was in 2008. That the market is very liquid, there's very great number of sources of supply. Their ability to come back into the market and knock everybody out is limited. LNG may go away, but it will come back. So as soon as they raise the prices, because we've got huge numbers of LNG terminals across Europe, as soon as the spot market moves, you'll get the LNG back into the market. So it's in many ways the problem with playing price war is that you're just losing margin, and which you will never get back.
Go ahead, Maria.
To go to add a couple of points, as I've been working on this topic for a while, to what extent Western sanctions affected energy sector in particular, and to agree with Alan on many points, is that in the short term, Russian gas companies are full of cheap gas that they can export, but the main question is around 2030, as the Skolkovo experts cited in their report. Then after this, the cumulative effect of sanction will weigh on those companies. In terms of financial sanctions for Western Siberia, you will need more investments to develop new, and in Eastern Siberia, it's a combination of both technological sanctions, but also financial sanctions to tap into new reserves. And in the Arctic, those very much hyped projects as Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG 2 would not be profitable without very generous state support. So the recent developments in the Arctic show the very tough strain on the Russian budget, as there are more increasing calls to attract private investors in the Arctic, as all ambitious projects cannot be funded by the Russian budget itself.
All right. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Robert Cutler.
Well, thanks to the audience and the panelists for the thrilling and superlative presentation. It's clear to me that there are probably many more questions that we didn't have time for, and This is going to be an evolving situation, so perhaps in 5 or 6 months, we can do another webinar on Nord Stream, perhaps with the same panelists. There will be, by the way, ongoing approximately monthly webinars by the Energy Security Program. And on October 20th, for example, there's one scheduled on what is energy security, what does it mean, and with including what does it mean for Canada, but not only for Canada, but for Canada. November 17th, there is another webinar. It's still, topic is still being narrowed down. It's going to be Central and Eastern Europe or Southeast Europe, away from Nord Stream topics. One thing that's clear to me, that's clearly that this webinar has made clear to me, is that we definitely need a webinar dedicated to Ukraine and Belarus. If it's not November, it will be next year. These are more or less monthly, as I said, September, October, November. Probably we will skip December because people are putting their minds to other things. And then we'll pick up in the new year in late January or February, March, April, May. So if you want to be informed and you don't have an easy way to be informed about these, you can always follow the NATO Association on Facebook or Twitter. Visit the website. There's an email sign up somewhere, and then you can find out about everything else that all the other wonderful things that the NATO Association does, and of which I'm very happy to be a part. So I'll just close it now, and one more time, thank everybody involved for kicking off the Energy Security Program's webinar series in such a smashing way.
Cheers, Robert. Thanks so much. And thanks so much to Slawomir, Alan, and Maria. Real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.